chill and relaxing video game. Evil and intimidating endgame mode. Gacha games and endgame are two things that seemingly mix about as well as oil and water. But have you ever thought about why that is? Well, I haven't. That was at least until a few days ago. With the release of the latest shiny new Genshin Impact endgame mode, which definitely isn't polarizing. Not at all. Not at all. Okay, maybe it is in fact a bit polarizing. Hence why I'm making this video. Since after seeing the fallout that this game mode caused, well, it got me thinking. What is it exactly that makes it so rare for gacha games to nail the end game? Well, in my opinion, the main culprit for this being the case, at least from what I've figured out, has to do with the act of having to balance between making the end game both for whales and free-to-play players, and every subgenre of player, for lack of a better word, that reside within these two groups. And it's precisely this balancing act which seems to be the culprit behind most of the polarizing opinions regarding the latest Genshin Impact endgame mode, with most of these complaints also applying to most other gacha game endgame modes. Well, at least the ones to my knowledge. I also think another factor that plays a big part in being responsible for gacha endgame being mid, for lack of a better word, has to do with the fact that most gacha games rarely prioritize endgame in the first place, concluding that instead there are significantly better ways for them to allocate their resources. And to be honest, yeah, they are probably right in thinking that. And what I mean by resources is not just the budget, but also time and manpower. Since whilst it is true that many of these companies making gacha games do basically have unlimited money, what they don't have is unlimited manpower and time, which necessarily can't always be solved by throwing more money at it. To use Genshin as an example, wherein the devs seemingly deem that putting most of their resources into the world quests, Archon quests, and open world exploration is a much better use of their resources, rather than developing an intricate endgame mode, which then leads to the devs, when creating endgame, to most likely needing to resort to using a lot of reused assets. And because of this, the easiest way to make it challenging is through HP inflation, which is something you can learn more about by googling Genshin Impact inflation. But beyond beefing up the enemy HP, another method of increasing the challenge without having to develop new mechanics is through the introduction of a timer. And it's precisely these two things that are considered by many to be our partners in crime, so to speak, and the things responsible for as to why a lot of people consider gacha endgame to fall flat. Something, if I'm going to be honest, I don't really agree with. Now, don't get it twisted, okay? And let me cook for a minute. You can also lower the pitchforks now. Thanks. Because whilst I neither think timers nor HP inflation are inherently the problem, what I do think on the other hand is that many gacha games tend to over-rely on these two things as a means to increase difficulty when creating endgame, since it is after all a drastically cheaper method of increasing difficulty than having to spend resources making the fights itself harder through the introduction of new mechanics or through creating entirely new fights entirely. But even in games that are generally used as reference points as to how many players would want gacha endgame to be like, with those types of games generally being MMOs like Final Fantasy XIV or World of Warcraft. Well, here's the thing, those games also use timers. Like, a lot. And I do mean like, a lot. Did I mention they use timers a lot? Well, either way, these games use timers a lot. In the sense that literally every endgame boss in these games have some sort of enrage mechanic, which forces you to optimize damage, usually to a degree that is even more extreme than what is required in gacha endgame. Though it's also worth to point out that those games don't need to jump through hoops in an attempt to make their endgame enjoyable for both whales and F2P players, something which has the intended side effect of potentially making gacha endgame timers maybe a bit too unreasonable a lot of the time, to say the least. And now, to somehow segue this into the so-called elephant in the room, if you will, that of course being Stygian Onslaught, the new, shiny, and not at all controversial endgame mode in Genshin. Now, I personally, to the surprise of probably some people, do in fact actually find Stygian Onslaught to be quite decent and fairly enjoyable of an experience overall. Actually, I would even go so far as to consider it a pretty fucking great endgame mode. Although, only when compared to that of other gacha endgames. But considering the topic of this video, yeah, I doubt that last statement means much. But that's obviously not to say that the endgame mode is without flaws. With basically all of said flaws, funnily enough, also linking back to the previous talking points in this video, hence making this endgame mode a perfect victim to dissect for this video. The main issue, so to speak, when it comes to Stygian Onslaught is primarily the gaps in difficulty between the last three difficulties, particularly the gap between the last two, and also that some of the most lucrative rewards are locked behind said difficulty. So, how do we quote-unquote fix Stygian Onslaught then, within a realistic set of boundaries, of course? Well, to do that, we are actually going to borrow from another gacha endgame mode, more specifically, from another miHoYo IP. And I am of course referring to the superior gacha endgame mode, the honored one of gacha endgame, if you will, for I am of course talking about Deadly Freaking Assault, baby, or Deadass for short. Yes, CCC, the game that in my opinion has by far the best endgame out of any gacha game I've played. Is it perfect? Of course not, but CCC actually, in my opinion, have really good gacha endgame. Not to mention that it also resets weekly, which, based. Granted, contrary to most gacha games, CCC doesn't really follow the mold we established prior, in the sense that it's actually built around the endgame to a significantly larger degree than any other gacha game that I'm aware of. But what exactly is it that Deadass does that makes it such a good gacha endgame mode? I mean, isn't it just the same old fights against the timer? And yes, on the surface level, that is very much true, but in practice, it actually ends up solving most of the issues mentioned earlier, partially because it resets bi-weekly, with CCC's other endgame mode resetting on the weeks when Deadass isn't. Hence you end up getting weekly endgame, which also means that having more restrictive fights isn't that big of a deal due to how frequently it resets. Now, compound this with the fact that you needn't to actually kill the boss to get all of the rewards, unlike in a certain other endgame mode, on top of how it allows for less skilled players to not feel completely left out, whilst also allowing the Giga Sweats and the whales to push themselves to their limits. And the way Deadass manages to do this is actually surprisingly easy to implement into Stygian Assault, since the way the game mode works is by converting the damage dealt to the boss into a score, and when reaching certain score thresholds you gain a medal, with the total amount of medals you can gain from one boss being 3, which requires a total score of 20,000, with a total score for a boss being 65,000. 60,000 damage score and an additional 5,000 damage score you can gain by correctly dealing with a unique mechanic each boss has, with there also being 3 bosses in total each Deadly Assault, with you only needing 6 out of the total 9 medals to get all of the valuable rewards. So yeah, if you now were to apply this in a fashion that is of course, to dire difficulty in Stygian Onslaught, and I say dire difficulty since I believe dire difficulty is where most people's grievances lie after all. Well, it might just be me, but personally I think this, on top of reducing the restrictedness in units required for certain bosses, Secret Source Automaton, would in fact solve most of the problems people currently have with Stygian Onslaught. And to now visualize these changes, imagine that by reaching certain HP thresholds on bosses in dire difficulty, you get these medals, just like in CCC. To use as an example, let's say 1 medal for roughly every 20% of HP, with the last medal being given when killing the boss, which means 5 medals in total from each boss, which equates to a total of 15 medals between all 3 bosses combined, with these medals then being able to be exchanged for the weapon skins. with the 5-star, one costing the total 15 medals and the 4-star weapon requiring a bit less than that, meaning that even if we do get new skins every Stygian Assault, there would still be no FOMO, since you can still opt to buy the old skins instead whenever you got enough medals, which also has the positive side effect of not completely cacking the non-meta teams. But sadly, it can't all be sunshines and rainbows, since we still need to remember that this is in fact a gacha game at the end of the day. So, therefore, there must be in turn also always be some sort of mechanic that exists solely to cack the players who don't spend. So with this in mind, I guess you could give like a 25% discount on the amount of medals a weapon skin costs if said weapon is the new skin from the current Stygian Onslaught. Just like how to do with the character skins, basically. With this then having the intended consequence that it might take a few patches for most F2P players to get the weapon skins, hence still incentivizing vertical investment through attaining signature weapons or constellations. So in other words, spending money on the game and lining Daddy miHoYo's pockets. But yeah, enough about that, since nobody wants to hear about those kind of systems. And I also don't really like giving gacha game companies these types of ideas. But on the other hand, I also know that it might make them take the proposal a bit more serious, if you will. Obviously not that I expect them to see this video or anything in the first place. But better safe than sorry. So yeah, I tried not to go too unrealistic, for lack of a better word, with these changes. Basically only having the point system and medals added, with everything else basically being the same. That's about all I think, as to how I would, for lack of a better word, fix Stygian Onslaught, and also why gacha endgame tend to be kinda mid, with it mainly boiling down to allocation of resources, and endgame not getting the biggest piece of the pie, so to speak, mainly due to how niche the participation of endgame and gachas tend to be in general. Hence, said resources are deemed better spent elsewhere. So yeah, if you like this video, please consider checking out any other of my videos, and maybe even give me a sub. Oh, that would be nice. I also got more videos in the works, so stay tuned. And with that said, thank you for watching.